Let's spend a little bit of time talking about earthquakes right now, how they're created, what types of faults are involved, those kind of things. Causes of earthquakes is due to bending and breaking of the rocks. So it's just like if you would take a wooden stick and you would start to bend it, and it starts to bend and bend and bend and bend, and eventually it will break. The stick will eventually break. It does not break, however, until it reaches a certain point, and we call that point the elastic limit. And what happens is, that stick has this energy stored in it, and as you're bending it, that potential energy is going to eventually get transferred, and it's going to cause that stick to break. And we call that the elastic limit. And that's exactly what causes earthquakes to occur also, is when the rock gets to that limit where it's going to break, or that elastic limit. The energy or forces needed to break the rock has to be constant motion from the Earth's surfaces. So this energy and these forces are always acting upon the land, whether they be divergent, convergent, transform boundaries, but there's always this movement going on. It's not like all of a sudden it starts up and it starts quick. It's something that's going always moving. And this movement of these plates causes stress on these rocks. And if this rock, the stress from this rock causes a breakage, these vibrations that are created from this breakage, after it reaches its elastic limit, they create things called earthquakes. That's how earthquakes are created. Now, there are three types of forces or stresses that can cause these earthquakes: tension, compression, and shear. So remember, those are the types of stresses or types of forces that are involved in this. Faults form when their rocks reach that elastic limit that we talked about, and you get breakage along the rock line. And remember, this goes all the way deep, not just along the surface. When they break, they move along surfaces, and these surfaces that the breakage moves along are called faults. You need to have a lot of energy to make this happen. This just doesn't happen with a small amount of energy. Because remember, these rocks along these faults can move in all directions, not just in towards each other like divergent or away convergent or sliding back and forth, but they can move up and down on each other also. So this fault is formed when these rocks meet this elastic limit, reach this elastic limit, and you get breakage. And you have to remember that along these fault lines that you can have movement in all different directions. There are three types of faults, and the faults are named according to the type of stresses and the type of movement that you have. So number one, we have normal faults. The type of stress or forces that we're talking about here is called tension forces, and this causes your rocks to pull apart. They're divergent. And the movement is in a downward relationship to the fault surface. So you're going to also get the movement apart, which is making that area thin in the middle, that divergent, but you're also getting it where you're getting movement downward in relationship to that initial fault surface. That's called the normal fault. A reverse fault, the type of stress or force that we're talking about, is compression, which is a convergent, which means they're moving together. Those rocks are squeezing together. They're moving upward, almost in like a mountain area. How mountains are created. And you also have movement in the opposite direction. So you're getting that movement together and you're getting that movement upward. The third type is called strike-slip faults. This is when you get that shear force, that shear tension or that shear force, and they're sliding across each other, and they can get stuck, and they just keep moving and moving and moving until they shear apart. So those are the three types of fault: normal, reverse, and strike-slip. Here's a picture of the normal fault. Please notice that you have your tension, which is pulling the rocks apart, divergent, and you also get that downward movement there that was talked about. Next is our reverse fault. Remember, they're moving together, and we're also getting direction movement in the opposite direction. We're getting that pushing up of the direction here, different than our normal fault with our direction of movement. All right. The last type of fault are strike slip faults. And notice that we are getting that sliding back, and the shear force pushes the rocks past each other, and it creates that fault line. The next thing we're going to talk about is seismic waves, and there are 3 different types of seismic waves that we're going to talk about. We're going to be doing a slinky lab, and when you shake the slinkies, the energy goes through the slinky in waves, and we're going to notice that when we do our lab with that. This is also how your seismic waves travel through the earth. When an earthquake is created, that energy is released in the form of seismic waves. This is created, again, when that elastic limit is reached and that energy is released. Always keep in mind that when we're talking about our seismic waves and how they travel, that the ground can move forward and back, up and down, or side to side. So it can move in all these directions. And waves can ripple like waves in water do also. 3 types of seismic waves. First, you need to understand what the focus point is. This is something that was missed a lot on the final. It was missed a lot when we talked about seismic waves before. Both epicenter and focus were both vocabulary words of ours. The focus point is the part where the earthquake originates in the ground. The epicenter is directly above that on the surface. So the focus is where the earthquake originates, and then the waves travel away from that point. They can travel in 3 different types of waves. Number 1 is your primary waves. We know that our primary waves from our vocabulary words are our fastest waves, and they get there first. They also move back and forth in the same direction that the wave is traveling, and we will demonstrate that with our slinkies. Secondary waves move at right angles in direction of the way that they are traveling. They do not travel in liquid. Primary waves can travel in solid, liquids, and gases. Also, secondary waves are slower and always get there second. The last type of waves are called surface waves, and they move in a rolling and swaying movement. These waves cause the most damage during an earthquake. This whole slide is really important for you to know. The epicenter is the point on the surface above the focus, as we talked about before. These surface waves created by this energy reaches the surface and travels outward from the epicenter. That's why it causes the most damage. The waves travel at different speeds, as we talked about before. Primary is the fastest, secondary and surface waves secondary is the next, and surface waves are the slowest. The different speeds used are to determine where the epicenter is. So we can go back and we can determine what waves come first, what waves come second, and then we can determine the length of time that it took for the primary and secondary waves to get there, and we can figure out where the epicenter is based on that. How do we measure it? The further away the epicenter is, the more distance between the primary and surface waves. A seismograph is used to measure the seismic waves. It records the arrival time of the waves. We can do this because the 3 waves travel at different speeds. This is a seismograph, and you notice there's 2 different types of seismographs because they're going to measure waves that travel parallel with the ground and waves that travel at a right angle with the ground. And that you notice that the shaking of that is going to cause the pen to move on the drum, and it's going to start creating a diagram on the paper. So when the waves reach the machine, the drum vibrates, causes the pen to start recording. The waves arrive at different times, and that is what is recorded on your seismograph. So if we want to use our seismograph information to locate a epicenter, we can do that. We just need to make sure that we have 3 or more stations to determine where the epicenter is. We then draw circles around each station. The radius of the circle represents the distance from the epicenter. And then where all of these intersect is where the epicenter originated. Below that is the focus. So it's important to understand that it takes 3 or more stations to do this. We're going to do an activity where we actually do this, and it has to do with the speed of the waves and the difference between the P and the S waves. So seismologists study earthquakes, and they're the ones that gather all this information. Our seismographs are used to record the seismographs, and we use those to study earthquakes. The magnitude of the earthquake is measured on what we call a Richter scale. So a Richter scale is used to measure earthquakes. It measures the height of the lines recorded on the seismograph, which tells us the magnitude or the strength of the earthquake. For each increase of 1 on the Richter scale, it is 10 times more powerful. So that scale that we use, 1 to 10, it's more powerful 10 times as we go up each time. So it's exponentially increased. The Mercalli intensity scale is what we use to measure the amount of damage at that earthquake spot. Tsunamis are a result of earthquakes, and what they are is it's the underwater that causes the water movement on the ocean floor. The ocean floor moves because of the earthquake, and then it causes this huge wave. It causes a powerful wave that can travel great distances in all directions, and they break onto shore, and they cause large walls of water. The good thing about tsunamis is that we can have warning signals for tsunamis because we can figure out the magnitude of the earthquakes and where they were and be able to tell where those tsunamis are going to go. So earthquake safety is a very top priority for these areas so that people can be evacuated.